And everybody, it's Rachel Andrew. If you don't know her, she runs Grab a Perch. She's all involved in web standards forever and has been very influential in bringing us a lot of the stuff she's going to be talking about with you today, which is really awesome. So go ahead and take it away, Rachel. And at the end, I will pop on with a few questions and we'll go from there.
Okay, cool. I will have to see if it can work out the technology. So I hit share screen here, do I?
Indeed. And then you should be able to pick.
Right. Yes. That one.
There you go.
All right. Now, if I hit play, hopefully.
That's it. You're up.
You've got my slides. Now what have I got here? I don't want that here. Hang on. Oh no. Oh, what on earth happened there? I can't see anything now.
You can escape out and then I think it looks like it just switched over to the other screen or something, or Keynote got confused. We could see your slides.
Right, okay, let me try that again.
Unshare and reshare if you want to try. Or...
right. Can you see my slides now?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll not touch anything anymore.
There you go.
Great. Okay. So yes, I'm Rachel Andrew, and I'm going to talk a bit about CSS layout as it currently is in 2017, specifically about Grid and Flexbox. So a little bit about me. I'm kind of the token front-end talk, I think, here. I'm also a PHP developer. I'm not talking about that today. I'm a CSS working group invited expert, and the sort of day job is that I'm half the team behind Perch CMS. So CSS and front-end development is one part of my job. I do most of the front-end stuff that we need to do, but it's also pretty much my hobby. So CSS is kind of like my weird hobby, and I've been a long-time supporter of and contributor to web standards. And so that's why I do all this sort of CSS stuff as well as business stuff and promoting my product. So I'm going to talk today about what really is my very favorite CSS subject and something that's kind of the focus of the work that I do with the CSS working group, and that's CSS layout. And this has just been a really exciting few years for layout. And this year, things are kind of all coming to a head, and we're actually getting into our hands a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. So when we talk about CSS layout and how it's kind of been up till now, we're talking about things like floats, or maybe you're using inline block for layout, or even display table. We've obviously got positioning, and these techniques are difficult because they were never designed for full page layout of applications. They weren't designed for the sort of things we build today. They sort of come from a time when the web was really academic documents with images floated in them. And so this is why layout is hard and actually quite fragile. And this has led, I think, to a lot of the frameworks that we see, because nobody wants to spend their time calculating the size of floats. And so we've got these frameworks that kind of take away a lot of that maths for us. But there is hope, and this kind of comes in the form of this group of CSS modules, and it's a group of modules that are really going to redefine how we do layout on the web. And that really started with Flexbox. I'm sure a lot of people listening have used Flexbox already. And then we've got CSS Grid Layout, and then there's a module called Box Alignment Level 3, which you've been using if you've been using Flexbox. It's not something we talk about on its own really, but this is a module that kind of brings the other two together as a new layout method for the web. And I'm going to talk about browser support towards the end. So kind of put that on hold for now, and just let's have a look at how these modules work together. Now, when we're talking about new CSS, I think we like to talk about them in terms of the problems that they solve for us. And the reason they solve these problems, the problems that we have in layout, is because they have a bunch of characteristics that we don't see in our existing methods. And some of those things are that they properly separate document source order and visual display. And they give us true alignment control. They give us the ability to center things, horizontally and vertically. That's kind of one of the big jokes in web development, is that you can't center anything. And they're responsive by default. They remove this need to calculate percentages and to try and make columns fit at different breakpoints. And something that's very important about them is that they give items relationship to each other. Once you use one of our new layout methods, things kind of understand that they sit in an overall layout. One item is part of the layout rather than just this independent thing floating in space. And that's really kind of a lot of the problem with our existing layout methods is just this issue of not being able to tell one element that it needs to respond to some feature of another. And we see that in the most simplest way with a floated layout. If I've got two blocks and I float one left, I float one right, and one of them's taller than the other, I've actually got no way to tell the shorter block to visually extend to the height of the taller one. And we've been trying to create these full height columns for years. If anyone else is quite old and has been doing this for a very long time, you might remember this is an article on A List Apart by Dan Cederholm. And he was talking about something he called the faux columns technique. And the faux columns technique was where we used a vertically tiled background image to create the illusion of a full height column. And this kind of worked okay when we didn't have responsive design, because most of us were pretty much building fixed width websites. So you could say, oh, well, that column's 200 pixels wide. I'm going to have a 200 pixel wide image and tile it down the back. It'll look like a full height column. That became pretty difficult with responsive design. And it was sort of at this point that a lot of people, and myself included, I wrote a book about it, we jumped on this idea of using display table. And what display table does is it uses the table properties in CSS, the things that are used for actually displaying HTML tables. We turn other things into a CSS table. And the thing about tables is that everything inside understands that it's inside a table, and it understands it's inside a row. And so it gave things relationship. It allowed us to do things like full height columns. It gave us some alignment capability. And really that was a precursor to what we've now got with something like Flexbox and Grid. And Flexbox and Grid take this idea of relationship of the items inside your Flex or Grid container, and they really run with it. And that's really where a lot of their power comes from. So here's a Flexbox example, full height columns. That's pretty much the basic behavior of Flexbox and of Grid. So this is a Flexbox example. So we're taking advantage of a lot of the initial default values of Flex. We've got a wrapper there, we're saying display Flex, and inside we've got a sidebar and content. The sidebar there, the grey background on it, is running to the height of the content area. The background colour goes all the way down to the bottom. And that's because the two items are inside a Flex container. They know about each other. They know they're both Flex items. They're both working together. And so we can have these full height columns. And so this is a grid layout example. So here I'm saying display grid. I've got two columns. The sidebar is starting at grid column line 1 and the content starts at grid column line 2. Once again, we've got this full height column by default. And so in all of the examples in this talk, this idea of elements understanding their place alongside the rest of the layout, that's really important, and it was really why these things work. So something else, we've got this separation of source and display. And this idea has been around for a very, very long time. Again, going right back to when we first started using CSS for layout, when we were moving away from tables. This is something that we kept saying, you don't want to tie your display to your markup by using tables. If you use CSS, you're going to have this separation. You can do all kinds of designs on the same markup. If you ever looked at the CSS Zen Garden, that was kind of all about this stuff, was about having one document and everybody doing a different web design with CSS on top of that document, because that's kind of what CSS positioning, as we called it then, using CSS for layout meant. We didn't need to chop things up and sort of stick it into table cells. So we talked a lot about this separation of content and markup from display. But it's a bit of a failed promise, especially once responsive design came along. I think most people have, cut with an HTML document, done it at one breakpoint, and then realized at another breakpoint, oh, I want those ads to end up down here, and oh, so you need to move them in the markup to get them there, and having to make compromises sometimes about the markup to get the display that you want. Now, one of the things about these new layout methods is they do a lot of this separation of source and display. So here's a Flexbox example. So I've got some navigation here, and it's laid out with Flexbox. And the flex direction property is set to row, which is actually the initial value of Flexbox. If you didn't put flex direction in, you get a row anyway. And you can also use column, which would display the items in a column. But if we want to switch the order of flex items, we set that flex direction property to row reverse. Or if you're working in a column, you could set it to column reverse, and it flips the items. We can also set the order of items using the order property. So here I've got a set of items, and they're just displaying in source order in a flex container. So I've put numbers on them so we can see what their sort of natural DOM order is, 1 to 4, these items. So we can change their order. So by taking, I've got the source order number 1, and I've changed it so it's now number 3 visually. So we can switch these things around using the order property. Now CSS Grid works in 2 dimensions. You've got both rows and you've got columns, and you can position things on the grid, really anywhere on that grid, once it's a child of the container. So here I've got a wrapper, and I'm saying display grid, which means that all child elements now become grid items. And I'm creating a 3-column grid. So I've got 3 equal columns there. Now here I'm starting to position my items with CSS Grid Layout, Grid Column and Grid Row properties. Now I'm only spanning 1 column and row track with these items, so the line number is the line the item starts on. If I wanted to span more than 1 track, I'd add a / and then the end line. We'll see some examples of that later. So I'm positioning the things around the grid, and it doesn't really matter in which order they are in the source. I can position them anywhere on that grid. And so we end up with this. The grid items are just like flex items. They need to be a direct child of the element that becomes a grid container, but then you can position them wherever. You can leave white space. They'll sit in the row and the column that you put them in. They're not going to kind of float up like floats do. They'll just be positioned wherever you want them. But there's more that we can do with grid and placing items. So grid layout also includes these auto placement rules. So once you've created a grid, you can kind of do 2 things. You can approach your layout in 2 different ways. You can position everything on the grid. So you can say, well, these are my grid items, and I want this one here and this one here. Or you can say, here's a grid, here's some content, just lay it out, please. And that's what the automatic placement rules do. So in the previous example, if I removed all the positioning information from those elements on the grid, they'd be displayed by grid in source order. So this is literally, I've got a list of items, I've said on the container, display grid, and it just lays them out 1 in each grid cell. And that's kind of the default behavior of grid. It'll not layer things up, it'll just pop them into empty cells. And it'll create new row tracks on the grid if it needs them, in what we call the implicit grid. So if I add a few more images to the gallery, and I've got some images which I'm going to display, they're kind of portrait images, and some are landscape. Now landscape images, I'd like them to span 2 tracks of my grid. That'll kind of put them more in proportion with the portrait ones. So what I do, if I put a class on those images, I've got a class of landscape, and I say grid column end span 2. So what that's saying to grid is the end line, please span 2 lines before you do that end line. And so this gives me this kind of layout. So auto placement here, it lays out that portrait image, and then it comes across a landscape one. So that needs 2 tracks. So it lays that out in 2 tracks. And then we've got item number 3, and that's also a landscape image. Now that isn't going to fit in the little space we've got left. So grid just moves on to the next row, and it displays the landscape, and then it goes and it displays the next portrait ones. So by default, what it's doing, it's progressing forward. It's keeping the items in the same order that they are in the source, which is often what you want. However, you can also add a property of grid auto flow and give that a value of dense. And once you've done that, grid will backfill your gaps. So what's happening now is grid's moving through. It found that portrait image, it found the landscape image, it missed that little gap and placed item 3. It comes across item 4, And it's like, great, that will fit in a gap already left. It takes it out of source order and it puts it into the gap, which is brilliant for your image gallery or your list of products that don't have any natural order. It would not be so great for your form. So there's a big implication here in terms of accessibility, and I'm sure lots of people listening have already kind of thought that. You know, what happens if our visual display ends up completely out of sync with the source order? And this is particularly a problem for people who are tabbing around the document, so they're navigating with the keyboard. You know, from the things I've shown you, it would be very, very easy to end up with a situation where, you know, you're tabbing around and you're jumping right down to the bottom of a document and you're back up to the top again. And that's going to be, you know, very jarring for people. So I think we've kind of got quite a bit to learn about how this is all going to work in terms of accessibility. Now, ideally, what these new layout methods enable is for us to create the most accessible source documents. So we can create really great source documents and then use the power of reordering to display things in the most optimal way for each breakpoint, and still considering how people are using assistive technology will work with our document. And I think most of the time, if you kind of work mobile first, so you have a good document, you have it sort of visually then displayed as well for mobile, so it works quite well, because actually as you're scrolling through something on a phone, that often kind of dictates how the source order should be. So getting that visual display right and getting that visual display in sync with your document, so everything's in the same order, that's probably a good place to start. And then take great care as you create wider screen layouts that you're not moving things around in such a way that someone using the keyboard is going to be jumping all over your document to get to things. So that's kind of something you're going to need to test. I think hopefully people are going to be thinking in that way, and they'll be sort of at least trying their best to make that work out. I think what would be bad is that this reordering capability will just encourage people to forget about source order. Because you sort of think, oh, well, it doesn't matter. I can move things around wherever. I don't need to go back to my document and sort out the source because I've realized that things should be in a different order. There's something of a worse danger, and that's because elements only become flex or grid items if they're a direct child of the grid container. I think there's a little bit of a temptation for individual web developers, but probably more likely authoring tools, so visual authoring tools that are allowing you to create, say, a grid layout. There'll be a bit of a temptation, I think, to strip markup, to kind of flatten everything out so that everything becomes a direct child of your grid container, and then everything becomes really easy to position. Watch out for things starting to do that kind of thing as grid layout becomes more well used, because that would obviously be very, very bad for having good semantic documents and for the accessibility of these things. The spec, this is from Flexbox, the grid specs has a similar sort of statement that authors need to use order only for visual, not logical reordering of content. When a specification says authors, that means us, that means web developers. So it's saying that we should use the order only for visual reordering of content. So if you're creating logical order by using, say, order or using positioning in grid, you probably need to go back to your document and make sure that that matches the sort of logical order. You need to take a bit of care with that. Because the visual stuff is only visual. The tab order follows the document. Any text-to-speech device will follow the document. So that's kind of the important thing to have in the right order. And this is a really great video. I'd encourage everyone to watch this video from Leonie. She talks about this problem in the Flexbox context. But as I say, things are pretty much the same situation in grid, although they can potentially be much worse because of the sort of two-dimensional nature of ordering. So if you want to think a bit more about accessibility, have a look at that video. It's a really interesting video, and Leonie's a great speaker, so it's enjoyable to watch. So we'll get away from reordering. Now it appears that the hardest challenge in web design has been vertical alignment. And this is something that our new layout methods really solve. And I'm sure if you've been using Flexbox already, you know about this, you know about how it makes alignment so much easier. And this is where we bring this this specification called Box Alignment Module Level 3. Now this module contains the features of CSS that relate to alignment. And what it essentially does is it takes all of the neat alignment capabilities and the space distribution capabilities of Flexbox. They're taken out and they're put into a new specification. And the thing about them being in their own specification is that they can then be used by other specifications, such as grid layout, but ultimately anything else. You know, there's no reason, and the spec defines ways to use box alignment within block layout. So in the future, you might be able to use this alignment stuff on floated items or whatever else you want to do. So this is pretty good, you know, it's 2017, we can now center things. This is basically the vertical centering module, but it does cover a lot of other stuff like distribution of space and overflows and so on. So we've got a bunch of properties. We have justify content, align content, justify self, align self, justify items, and align items. And the alignment spec details exactly how each of these behave in different layout methods, because not all alignment properties can work on every layout method because they all have different sort of features and different constraints. So in our simplest Flexbox example, we use justify content space between to space our items out evenly. That's kind of Flexbox 101. So the first thing you do is, oh wow, you know, I can take these items and I can just space them out. You know, how long have we waited for that kind of ability? And we can do the same on a grid container. So obviously in a grid container, you need to have more space. So the total width or height of the tracks needs to be smaller than the size of your grid container. But then we can use space around or space between to space out the tracks. You have to be slightly wary in doing this because if you've got a gap, so in this example, I've got a grid gap of 10 pixels. That gap's going to get bigger if you use something like space between. But not only is the gap going to get bigger, but actually any grid area that spans over the gap is also going to absorb extra space. So you kind of need to think about that a bit in your design to make sure it can cope with this extra space appearing if you use something like space around or space between. And so here's some other examples of alignment. So this is back to a flex layout, so saying display flex. And then we've got 4 items, which are sort of equally in the container there. And the height of that flex container is being defined by the portrait image. So that's sort of holding the height out. And the other images are then being aligned against it. So that first item is the default stretch. And the second is centered in the container. The third is aligned to the start with flex start. And the fourth is aligned to the end. So that's aligning inside the flex container. And we can do the same thing with grid. So here I've got display grid and I've got a 4-column grid and the items are inside it. And so for grid, we have align self center, align self start and self end. So in this case, we're aligning the item inside the grid area, which might be one or more grid cells. Now, I actually think alignment is easier to understand in a grid context because grid has got both of the axes to align against. Flexbox gets a bit weird where you've only got one axis and that axis can kind of change depending on whether you're column or row. I put together this cheat sheet to kind of compare the two and how alignment works for grid and for Flexbox. Maybe I'll add to that if we start to get alignment properties in, you know, for other parts of CSS. At the moment, this is the only two that we're using box alignment in. So have a little look at that. It's kind of something that's worth just building some examples and playing around with it. It becomes a lot more obvious. It looks like an awful lot of stuff to understand once you start playing with it. And I think particularly with grid, it's quite obvious what you're doing, and you can then transfer that back to Flexbox. So alignment is great. It makes it far easier for us to create these responsive designs. And it's something about responsive design. It's very difficult to do if you can't align things and align groups of things. And so just the fact that Flexbox came along and let us do that, let us align all of these things, made it so much easier to create responsive designs. And that's actually something that's quite key to these new layout methods, is that they've all come along since responsive design became a thing. And I kind of know about sort of things that predate responsive design because my own product predated responsive design, and we've just been redesigning the UI because we kind of patched the UI for responsive as that came along and people wanted to start editing on their phones and things. But it was a patch, and we've just done this redesign of the UI to make responsive a kind of first-class citizen. So all of our older layout methods, you know, they were long before phones and so on were a thing and people using the web on small screen devices. But the new stuff, Grid and Flexbox, it's all been born since responsive. And so they think about the world in a responsive way. Because responsive design, I mean, it's going back quite a long way now. You sort of think, oh, this wasn't that long ago, but it was 2009 that Ethan wrote in his Illustrapart article. He talked about this technique for creating fluid grids. And talking about the aspect of the grid, the elements can be expressed as a proportion relative to the container. And so we all started doing this sort of thing, you know, adding these percentage values to our designs and debating like how many after the decimal point you needed to make it work, and coming up against strange rounding issues. These new layout methods kind of mean that we can, you know, get rid of those calculations and having to sort of work all this stuff out. So the space between and space around, that's just a really simple example of how the new layout methods sort of understand that there might be more or less space, and we don't really know how much space there's going to be, and it's going to change. So these values grow and shrink according to the available space in the container, whether that's a Flex or a Grid container. But Flexbox goes a bit further than this, because responsive design is essentially about proportion. That's what all those calculations were about. They were about us saying, well, you know, this sidebar needs to be 33% of the overall container. So we want to be able to distribute space in proportion. So as the layout gets bigger, things all scale up in the same sort of way. So we do this in Flexbox with this flex property. Now, flex is a shorthand. It's a shorthand for three properties. We've got flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And so flex basis is kind of the initial size before any growing or shrinking happens. Flex grow is how much space is added, and flex shrink is how much we take away when the thing gets smaller. So here I'm setting flex grow and flex shrink to 1, and that means that every box can grow and shrink to fit in the space, but my ideal box width is 300 pixels. And that gives us 3 boxes of equal width. So if I allow the items to wrap and add a few extra items, and then if we sort of drag the window smaller, and we see that when the boxes get smaller than 300 pixels, a box will wrap onto line 2, and it'll do that to try and maintain somewhere around 300 pixels. Now the thing with Flexbox is that every row, if you're working in rows, or column, if you're working in columns, becomes its own flex container. So space distribution happens across the row in this case. So on that top row, we've got 3 boxes. They're splitting the space equally. So they each, you've got these 3 and they're nicely lined up. The bottom boxes there, they're also going to grow equally. So they split the space and we end up with 2 with a line down the middle. They don't line up with the elements above. We can also play around with this. We can target individual items. So here I've added some rules for box 3. All of my boxes can grow and shrink from 300 pixels, but I've set box 3 to flex grow 0. So box 3 may not grow. It can't get any bigger than the 300 pixels. So this is what happens. So once the boxes have to stretch wider than 300 pixels, it stays static. It stays at its absolute position. Now this is really useful. If you want to create layouts that have got some fixed elements in them and other areas that you want to stretch, well, you can do that. You can just say, don't grow, you're this size, don't grow. And that'll happen, and then that amount of space is sort of taken away from the available space when space distribution happens. So that's really useful. But we can also assign different values to flex grow and flex shrink. So in this situation, I've set box 3 to flex grow 2, while the other 2 boxes remain at the default of 1. And we get this. Now, what this doesn't mean is that box 3 gets to be twice the size of the other boxes, because what we've got here, we've got this 300 pixel basis. So what Flexbox does is it takes the overall size in the Flex container, it takes away the 300 pixel basis for each of the items it needs to lay out, and then whatever's left over, it shares out according to that Flex Grow value. And you can also see that that has no effect whatsoever on the row below. On the row below, we've got 2 items. They're both got an equal flex factor, so they're both just spreading out, and they've got that line down the middle. Again, the flex stuff is just something you have to play around with to get your head around, I think. Just filling around with the different values and seeing what happens. It really is the place where Flexbox becomes incredibly useful once you kind of get your head really around how these flex values work. Here's a little calculator. You can stick in some different values and see how that will end up, what that will actually end up in terms of pixel values to help you to understand how those flex values are working. It's definitely worth spending a bit of time just creating some little examples and playing around with. I think it's somewhere that can be quite confusing until you realize exactly how that space is being assigned. So that's Flexbox. So Flexbox lets you assign space line by line. Each line, each row, each column becomes its own Flex container and doesn't really have any relationship to the things that come before and after. So with Grid, we're taking the other approach. With Grid, you define a grid and then you put stuff into it. So rather than doing sizing on the items, you do the sizing as you create your grid, and then things just have to fit into that grid that you've created. So to do that, we need to have a flexible unit that we can use when we create column tracks. And so Grid introduces a new unit, the FR unit. And this is only found in Grid layout, and it's for creating these flexible tracks. But if you understand how Flex Grow works, then you're going to find this reasonably easy to understand because it works in a very similar way. What it does is it allows you to assign a fraction of the available space in the container. So let's have a look at that. So here's our simple grid. We've got 3 columns, all with 1 FR as the width. So when you create your column tracks with Grid template columns, you can put in any length unit. So you could have, absolute width tracks with pixels if you wanted. But here we're using this FR unit, so we can have 3 equal width tracks. Now we don't need to add anything to the items. We've created a grid here, and the items are just going into that grid. So I'm going to play around with this. I can create 1 600 pixel column and then 2 1FR columns. So what's happening here? Grid is going to give the fixed width track the 600 pixels, and then whatever's left, it's going to split that between our 2 1FR columns. So we get 2 equal width 1FR columns after we've dealt with the fixed width track. And we can change the last column there and change it to 3 fraction units. So now we've got a 600 pixel track, we've got 1 FR and 3 FR. So we're going to add up the number of FR tracks there, so that's 4. So we split that space into 4. We give 1 part to the track 2 and 3 parts to track 3. And if you were to drag your window wider and smaller, that space would remain distributed between the two in the proportions that you want, with the 600 pixel track just staying 600 pixels. And then you can see the difference here between Flexbox and Grid, because we're setting the size of the complete column track here. If I add another row, the proportions stay the same. Everything in the middle track is going to say that 1 FR wide. So this really is the key difference between Grid and Flexbox. Flexbox is for one-dimensional layout, and that means laying things out as a row or as a column. So you can distribute your space across your row, or if your work is a column, you can distribute it across the column, but you can't do both at once. The Grid has been designed for two-dimensional layout, and that means rows and columns at the same time. But there's some things that we see with Flexbox, and that's quite nice with Flexbox, is this ability to get as many items as will fit in a row, and it just sort of redistributing them and then wrapping round. depending on how much space you've got. As you can see in this example, as the window gets larger and smaller, Flexbox fits in as many items as it can using 300 pixels as the basis, and then the additional space is distributed across each row equally. And we can actually do this with Grid. However, in this case, what we do is we create flexible tracks and then put content into them. This starts to all look a little bit complicated because Grid has a few sort of new features really to allow you to do this sort of stuff. So here I've got in my columns, I'm saying repeat. So we can use this repeat syntax to say, repeat as many tracks as we want. And you could just use that with a fixed value. You could say repeat 3 1FR, for instance, and that would give you 3 1FR columns. But here I'm saying repeat autofill. So I want Grid to fill as many columns as it can. And then I've got this min max. So I'm saying min max, my minimum is 300 pixels. So I want the minimum size of my column track to be 300. I want the maximum size to be 1 fraction unit. And what that means is that Grid will autofill as many 300 pixel column tracks as it can. And then it'll probably have some space left over. And because the maximum is 1 FR, that means distribute the extra space equally amongst the tracks, which gives us kind of the same effect as Flexbox, where you have this 300 pixel basis, but you can grow bigger and smaller than that according to how much space you've got. And so that gives us this. But you can see that unlike Flexbox here, items that go onto the next row stay lined up in their column. So we get this ability to have a flexible number of column tracks, but also keep things lined up strictly in rows and columns with Grid and with some of these new sort of functions that are part of the Grid spec. So Grid and Flexbox, they kind of, in some ways, are very similar, and sometimes there are going to be jobs where you could use one or the other, and it wouldn't really matter which one you picked. And I think as we start to use both together, we'll start to realize which are probably the best things to use for different things. And as a sort of a little demo of sort of thinking through this stuff, I wanted to recreate a pattern I've seen on a number of websites. We've got this sort of hero block of different panels used as navigation. Here's one here on the Tuts Plus site. The problem with these things is that with our existing layout methods, you need to fix the height of the blocks. So if any additional content gets in, it kind of overflows or it gets cut off or it just ends up looking a mess. So CSS Grid Layout and Flexbox really should make doing this sort of stuff very straightforward. And so as an experiment, I wanted to try and rebuild this in a way that kind of worked no matter how much extra content got stuck into blocks. And I ended up with this. So here I'm redefining the grid at 2 breakpoints, which kind of matches that layout that I was looking at. So I moved to 2 or 3 column layouts. We've got these sort of what look like fixed height blocks with content in. And so that sort of worked. I could build it. And a key thing to note there is that while those heights do appear to be fixed at 150 pixels, once I added some extra content, the row expands to contain the content. And you can see that in the sort of the top right news story there. It says angry people at Bloom Fiestas. We've added some more content. Someone's come along in the CMS and they've added a couple of extra paragraphs to really drive home their point. And instead of overflowing and looking a mess, it's just got taller. And the whole row's got taller. So right across the row, sort of behind those images, the whole row has got taller. Content isn't overflowing. And all the panel still lines up at the bottom. Now, that might not be exactly what the designer wanted, but it's an awful lot better than the content overflowing and getting cut off and being unreadable. So how does this work? We use that min-max function again, and this time we use it in track sizing. So here I've got a property grid auto rows. Now, this creates grid rows in what we call the implicit grid. Grid has these sort of 2 concepts of the explicit grid, and that's the grid that you describe with grid template columns and grid template rows. But then if you just keep on adding items outside of the grid you've created, Grid will just create new tracks for them. And they'll be auto-sized by default, so they'll just expand to take whatever content goes into them. But if you want to give them a height, you can use grid auto rows, or if you're working in columns, grid auto columns. So we could say grid auto rows 150 pixels, and that would match the Tuts Plus example. The tracks would be fixed at 150 pixels, but then you'd get your overflows, because as soon as the content hit 150 pixels, it would have to overflow in some way, and we don't want that. So instead, we say min-max 150 pixels, that's our minimum. Our maximum is auto, and auto will take its size from the content that's in that block. So that means that we get the nice looking fixed height of 150 pixels if the content is exactly as we expected it to be, but we get sort of a resilience to the real world of content on the web. If someone puts too much content in, it will stretch. And so we get these very precise layouts that also have this kind of hidden tolerance for what really happens when you get people and website designs, and that just sort of all work. And as for Flexbox, here's the sort of example where Flexbox is really great. I've got my block here. I'd like to have the text down at the bottom of the block. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying display flex direction column, and I'm just on the H3, I'm adding a margin top of auto. Auto margins are great, they absorb all the space. And so in conjunction with Flexbox, they're really useful for sort of just pushing things around. So the margin then takes up all the space and that content goes down to the bottom. And something else about grid layout is the fact that this ability to auto-generate new tracks to put stuff in, again, can help us with the real world of content on the web. Now, not every CMS will stop content editors from adding extra things. So if you're in that situation and you've got this nice, neat block of things, then a content editor comes along and thinks, oh, I'd like to add another news story, and sticks that into the CMS, and we've not got a design for that, so it just kind of appears somewhere. Well, with grid, at least it will appear in an extra box on the grid, which isn't what the designer wanted, but at least it's not broken. That's going to appear just in the next empty cell. It's not going to be a mess. It's going to be readable, and someone can come along and sort that out later. But it's not going to sort of overlay everything, because everything else has been so carefully positioned that all it can do is sit on top of it. So again, this is one of the nice things about grid. It kind of copes with the sort of stuff that we have and the kind of real things that happen with content on the web. It's that tolerance for the real world of content. Now, I've flown through a whole bunch of examples there, and you'll find all of those in this CodePen collection. So do go along and have a little play with those. It really is the best way to look at this stuff. I've also got even more demos of grid layout, and they're all over at gridbyexample.com. There's also a bunch of videos and all sorts of stuff about grid layout. Those are really useful just to sort of start to play with examples. The grid examples are all very much broken down ones, and the reason I'm sort of showing you these is because we're really right at a great time for these specifications. Now, Flexbox, as I'm sure a lot of you are already using, is very well supported in browsers. A lot of the sort of early problems with Flexbox have been worked out. There's a lot of green there on Can I Use. Now, grid. Now, grid doesn't look so pretty. And you might wonder, what's going on here? This seems to be marked as IE only. What's happening there? Now, that's because this specification actually came from Internet Explorer, believe it or not. The first draft was implemented in IE 10. So you can say thank you to Microsoft and the IE team for the fact that we've got grid at all. And this Can I Use chart, it may have changed. I took this screenshot this morning. But it hadn't updated. Actually, Firefox 52 shipped yesterday. Firefox 52 is the very first browser to have CSS Grid support, sort of actually in a live production browser. That came out yesterday. So if you update your Firefoxes, you should find that you have grid support, and all those examples that I just pointed you to, they'll work in Firefox, so you can start using it. Firefox has also got a really nice grid inspector built in, so you can inspect a grid and you can see all the grid lines that have made up that grid. Now, you can see all the little green flags there, and that's because grid has been behind browser flags in a lot of browsers, in Chrome, in Firefox until yesterday, and it's been in Safari Technical Preview. Now, grid is pretty much landing simultaneously this month in Chrome, Firefox and Safari. Let's say it went out in Firefox yesterday. It'll go out in Chrome next week, and it's in the current Safari beta, so we think probably end of March, beginning of April, that's going to come out in Safari. It's not prefixed, it's not sketchy, it's pretty much the entire spec that's at candidate recommendation, implemented in a very interoperable manner, as in it works in all those browsers very well. Nothing's really happened like this before. It's very unlike the kind of story of Flexbox that came out vendor prefixed and we started using it, and then it changed, and then it changed again. And I think a lot of confidence was lost. Grid's been developed behind these browser flags. I've been working with it and talking about it for 5 years. And during that time, it's been developed and it's been tested, and there's been lots of feedback from browser vendors and lots of feedback from web developers. And so the spec is very stable, and the implementations in browsers are very stable. So this is something that you can start to use. On this page, I'm keeping things up to date as possible as things sort of happen and as things ship into browsers. Now, I mentioned the note about Internet Explorer and Edge. So Grid came from them. You know, have they updated their spec? Are they going to update their spec? Well, we don't know. And I hope they will, because it's a real shame that we haven't had this sort of landing in every browser. That would have been really neat. So Grid is essentially in all modern browsers, but the IE and Edge implementation is quite different at this point to the up-to-date one. I mean, this was a long time ago when they shipped that implementation. For simple Grid layout, you can certainly use it as a fallback. And in the resources for this talk, I've got a blog post of mine where I kind of go into the things that work in that IE implementation and the things that don't. So that situation, we're going to have Grid in modern browsers. We've got some sort of Grid in IE and Edge. But then what about the old browsers? What about the people who haven't updated for some reason, or people using some sort of unusual user agent that we don't know about? What's going to happen with them? How do we deal with that? And for that, we have feature queries, and feature queries really are going to be your new best friend in this brave new world. If you've ever used Modernizer, then you totally will get the idea behind feature queries. And if you've ever used a media query, then you know exactly how to use them. So this is a feature query with @supports. So we've got this @supports rules. It's a bit like @media. And then inside the brackets, I'm saying display grid. So you need to use a property value pair. And you can test for vendor prefix things as well. So you can just test for, display MS grid or some other prefixed property. And then inside that statement, just like using media queries, inside there, you write your CSS for things that support whatever that property and value is. So in this case, I'm saying, does this browser support display grid? If it does, do this stuff. And so here's a very simple example, which is in that the CodePen stuff that I linked to. So here I've got saying has flex, has grid, and has grid shapes, display none. So to hide the boxes, and then if we've got support for them, show the boxes. So I can test for display flex, and I can test for display grid, and I can test for two things. I can test for display grid and shape outside circle. So you can test for more than one thing. And that will just, show the boxes if we have support for those things. So feature queries are really simple to use. And allow you to test for support before you use something, which means that you can write some CSS for older browsers and then test for support of the new thing, and then do anything you need to do to kind of undo whatever you did for the older browsers. And that's the kind of way to work with it. So it's a bit like when you start mobile first and then use a media query to check for screen size and sort of add to the design or overwrite things done for mobile. This is how we do this. We use the feature query to add to or overwrite the CSS for older browsers. So write CSS for browsers that don't have support, override the properties inside the feature queries. And those are two posts, one from Jen Simmons, the second one is something I wrote in the last couple of weeks, that just sort of go through that process of working with feature queries. A couple of sort of very specific tips for Grid in particular. Floated items, and this is all in the specs. You can have a look and see what the spec says about this stuff. If something's floated and then it becomes a grid or flex item, it loses its floated behavior. So you don't have to sort of undo floats. They'll just get undone as soon as they become a grid or flex item. vertical align has no effect on a grid item. So if you've used vertical align, say you're using display inline block or display table, and if you used vertical align, and then you make it into a grid item, vertical align has no effect. So you can then use the box alignment properties inside your feature query quite safely. If items are set to display inline block or block, they become grid items. They stop having the features of being inline block or whatever. So pretty much your overrides need to change widths, margins, and padding, things that you've added to make the older layout work well, and you might want to take off. If you end up with your grid tracks or flex basis and it's using a size that is unexpected to you, see whether you need to set a width back to auto. Flexbox, if you have your flex basis to auto and then you've got a width on an item, it will use that as its flex basis, which if you weren't expecting it to happen could be a bit unusual. So that's the thing to kind of keep an eye out for is, you might need to overwrite widths or like set them back to auto so that they don't start affecting the rest of the layout. This is an example. If you have a look in that code, you can poke around and see examples using feature queries, so you can check those out. And the good news about feature queries is they have really, really good support. You don't need to worry about the fact that IE11 doesn't have support because we're testing for support of things. We're saying, do you have support, and then doing stuff. So you can just assume that anything else is old, and that includes, IE11 if you're going to use grid, perhaps. So you don't necessarily need to worry about old browsers not supporting feature queries because the basic assumption is that things don't have any support, and then you're building on top of it. So basically, anything new in CSS, you can use feature queries to check for support of it. So if you want to use shapes, for example, or any new feature that comes along, you can use feature queries and see if that browser supports it, and then you can have a play around with it. So feature queries are really how you start using future stuff right now. And what I would say is with something like grid, I think the sort of conception is people think they see grid layout and think, oh, that's for doing your main layout and that's what it's for. And so I can't have no layout in old browsers, so I can't use it. Look at it for using it for UI elements, for small things, for making enhancements, for doing something with floats and then enhancing it with grid, doing something with inline block, enhancing it with grid. Small things, laying out forms or laying out definition lists or your gallery or whatever it is. It doesn't need to be everything. You can still use older methods and then just use a little bit of grid or a little bit of Flexbox to enhance it. Don't feel that you have to wait until you have 100% support, because we never have 100% support for anything. And don't forget to have fun. This stuff is really interesting to play with, and you can really sort of create some very nice effects by playing around with grid and Flexbox. So at least on a personal project or whatever, do have a look at what is possible and what is coming possible really this month. Thank you very much. There's resources there. There are on my slides and all links to that code you can find there. I will hang around to answer some questions in Slack. I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions now. And you can always grab me on Twitter if you want to ask stuff about grid particularly. Thank you.
Awesome. That was great. People were really freaking out in the chat. So blowing people's minds in there. And then you also blew everybody's mind by telling them that Microsoft introduced grid. So that
that's always quite fun to say.
Yeah, people were falling out of their chairs on that one. Because we do have a couple minutes, so I have like 1 or 2 questions here, and then there's people in the chat with questions. Obviously, you can go check out in there. But what you just brought up at the end is just my own thing here now is really interesting, because the idea of we spent so long. Like, how can we get this 3-column layout with a header and footer, right? Like, that was like the first 10 years of me working on the internet, right? Mm-hmm. Doing that without a table, all that stuff, right? And the idea of taking these new things and using it for a form or a little element in your app or whatever, and not just for your whole layout, which it can do, obviously, but even just as you're building new stuff into your existing projects and things like that, to just, use these new tools and kind of start chipping away at it without thinking that it has to only be for layout, the whole layout, or things like that. So
I think that's the thing is it's often a lot easier to say, oh, this solves a problem I've got. Okay, so some browsers are not going to look quite as neat because I can't get these things to line up very well, but it's okay. but then you can make it better, and an increasing number of people. I think a lot of people, give it a month or so, a lot of people are going to see 70 or 80% of people coming to their site have got grid layout support. If you've got a lot of Chrome users, once Chrome ships. So I think a lot more people are going to be able to use this stuff than possibly think they can, particularly if they're just thinking about small elements.
Yeah, well, we're so trained on like, okay, the new browser's out 5 years from now, I can use the new stuff. But now with the auto updating, it just rolls out so much.
Yeah. I think things are really changing in that regard. And I think there's, we're all a little bit frightened of using new stuff. And the way that CSS has kind of come out in the past, I think, and like the story of Flexbox, for instance, it wasn't great because no one could rely on it. And I think people are going to see grid is very different because it's all the browser vendors have just kept it hidden away until it's ready. No one wanted to ship it until it would be ready, and so it's pretty robust. So,
and so then, do you recommend? This came up in a number of questions in different ways. Do you recommend like trying to use JavaScript hacks or polyfills or other things to provide support for some of this new stuff to other older browsers, or do we think that now it's just like let it degrade in the older browsers and push ahead with the newer browsers?
Yeah, you don't want to polyfill your layout. It's going to be horrible. So, yeah, I think that really we've got methods of doing layout. They're not ideal. They're not perfect, but we could, because of the way that the overrides have been specified in the grid spec, it's pretty easy to overwrite stuff with grid things. And particularly because we've got feature queries to stick it all inside, so you don't end up, accidentally overwriting something that blows up your earlier layout. So, you can pretty much do a sort of a basic floated layout and then override that with grid, and everyone's okay. It's exactly the same layout that people would have had before you had grid, but an increasing number of people are going to get the really sort of finessed layout. Right. And over time, you'll need to do less of that old stuff because the number of people who are going to see it is going to reduce and reduce. And you can do something very, very simple for people with, strange user agents or very old browsers, just as we've done in the past as new things have come in.
And do you find, I assume not, but do you find the need to do any kind of server-side finagling of like adding extra elements in or anything like that?
We don't want to be doing that, no. Right. I mean, say obviously with the Perch UI, which we've recently been doing, now we support back to IE9 because we have people who put this in front of their clients, and their clients are using terrible old browsers. Right. So I've used a lot of Flexbox in that. And yeah, it works absolutely fine for browsers that don't support Flexbox. It looks a lot nicer in browsers that support Flexbox, but it's perfectly usable in those older browsers, and then we just enhance it with the Flexbox. So, if I'd been building that in a year's time, I would have probably done the same with grid. We may well do that anyway. But yeah, so it's certainly possible to do, and I don't live in any kind of ivory tower. As I say, my own product we have to support right back to IE9. So with a bit of care and just understanding how these things work, you can do an awful lot without kind of leaving people out in the cold, which we don't want to do.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much. Fantastic talk. And join us in Slack. And thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Let's bring up Adam.